Okay, so maybe we can go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Today we're delighted to have Roberto Emparan from Barcelona. He's going to tell us about the large D limit of Einstein's equations. So take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to talk here. I wish I could be there in person, but like everyone, we're looking forward to the time that we can have 3 seminars. So what I'm going to talk about is mostly a review or an overview of work that we have been over a number of years, since starting basically in 2013, with a number of collaborators that you can see over here. And I'm highlighting here 2 of them, Ryotaka Suzuki and Kentaro Tanabe, because they've been working on this from the beginning, from the first papers that that started this program. Okay. Now, last year that we wrote a review, an extensive review with Chris Herzog that covers most of what was done until last year. And in this review, you can find more details and more references for things that I will be talking about today. Okay, so I think that's the place to go if you want to learn more about this subject. But to begin, let me begin with something simple. I'm going to show for you here. Well, I think what's probably the simplest and maybe more perfect theories that we have in physics. One of them is the Young-Mills theory and general relativity. Here are the Lagrangians. Sometimes people call general relativity the perfect theory, but maybe it's too perfect. I mean, it's so simple that it hides a lot in this simplicity, and it hides a lot in a way that very often it's not simple to extract, to unpack these equations and get the physics. And it's the same thing with Young-Mills theory. Okay. And one of the problems with this, or at least for solving these theories, the way that they are, the reason that they are so perfect, is that these theories, they don't have any scale dimension full parameter here, even if at quantum level Young-Mills theory may develop a dynamically scale, but they have no scale. There's no parameter, not even anything that looks here like a dimensionless parameter here. And then, well, nevertheless, the equations are, and the theories are fully nonlinear, and they have a tremendous complexity. And in fact, it's very well known that this theory, in equations as simple as this, you can unwrap them in order to describe things like the collision of 2 black holes billions of light years away, the way that this collision creates ripples in space-time, and then how these ripples propagate throughout the entire universe until they arrive at our detectors. And all of that is just contained in something as simple as this. But as I say, I mean, these equations are famously harder to solve. And as I said before, one of the reasons that we don't have any parameter in these equations. And having a parameter that you can take to be small or large, taken to the boundaries of the allowed range of values of this parameter, that's something that's very useful in physics, because if you can take some parameter that it's very large or very small, then you can do perturbation theory. But how do you do this in these theories? Well, in the case of Young-Mills theory, it was realized almost 40 years ago that these equations contain a parameter. It's hidden here in this trace, the range of the gauge group that you have here, the number of colors that your gluons can have. There's this parameter hidden here, and then expanding in the limit where the number of colors becomes very large. That's something that's very useful and very fruitful. That was proposed by Toft, as I said, in 1974. And the large n expansion of Young-Mills theories, as I'm sure you know, it's something that's very useful for understanding the properties of the theory, and even it has led us to things like holographic correspondences and formulations of quantum theories of gravity. Now, in the case of general relativity, do we have a similar parameter over there? Well, actually, yes, because these equations contain another parameter that's hidden here, a dimensionless parameter, which is the number of dimensions. And of course, considering general relativity in different number of Friedel dimensions, d different than 4, that's something that people have been doing for a long time, right? Taking the limit where general relativity is formulated in lower dimensions, it's something that simplifies the theory a lot. You go to 3 dimensions, you lose gravitational waves. In the center of that case, you lose the black holes. You go even lower and then you lose everything. But well, you still keep diff invariance. So, I mean, this is a way in which maybe you can study. In particular, it's this low dimension limit. It's something that's very useful for studying quantum theories of gravity. But of course, you're losing a lot. And if in particular, if you're interested in black holes and gravitational waves, this going to low dimensions, that's not in general, or at least it need not be a good strategy. For black holes, it may still be good, but for gravitational waves, certainly it's bad. Whereas if we take d to be greater than 4, well, we're still keeping at least some of the essential classical physics of 4-dimensional gravity, right? So we keep both black holes and we keep gravitational waves. And the theory in general, the classical theory of general relativity is well defined for all d greater or equal than 4. And not only this, many problems, they can be formulated while you keep d arbitrary. Some problems don't. Some problems are specific to 4 dimensions. But some other problems, they don't rely so much on being in 4 dimensions. And you can write down your equations where d appears as a parameter. And then you can think of this parameter that appears in your equations as a continuous parameter, and then you can expand in 1 over d. This is very much the same as we do when we study, as I was saying, Young's theories at large n. You can write down some phenomena, you can write them down for arbitrary number of colors. So then you take n to be a continuous parameter and you expand in 1 over n. So to this point, there's some similarity in what we do in both cases. And as I said, well, in the case of Young's theories, taking the large n limit is useful because it simplifies sectors of the dynamics of the theory, in particular the sector of meson dynamics. It can be reformulated famously in terms of a topological expansion of string wall states. And that's, as I said, that's essentially behind things like the ADSC of the correspondence. Do we get something similar also when in gravity we take the large limit? Well, what I will try to argue for you in this talk is that yes, large D simplifies gravities. It simplifies at least some sectors of the dynamics, and in particular, it simplifies the sector of black hole dynamics, the fluctuations of the black hole horizons. Because then, well, these dynamics can be reformulated, can be reorganized into a theory of membranes. We will get effective theories for membranes for describing black holes in this large limit. So black hole dynamics simplifies. Do other sectors of the dynamics of large D gravity also simplify? Is this something that can be useful beyond black hole dynamics? Well, probably yes, but this has been much less developed so far. Whether we can get, for instance, this to be useful for describing gravitational waves or other phenomena, say near singularities or other things. But what I'm going to talk about mostly during this talk is what we get when we want to reformulate horizon dynamics. So what do we mean by, or what are the main properties of going to large D in general relativity? Well, when you take general relativity in more than 4 dimensions and you increase the number of dimensions, well, D appears in several ways in general relativity, in gravity. It appears on the one hand as the number of degrees of freedom at a point, the number of graviton polarizations that you have. The more dimensions that you have, the more directions in which your gravitons can be polarized. Okay? So it's in this sense, it's a measure, D square, it's a measure of the number of local degrees of freedom that you have at a point. And in this sense, regarding D in this, from this point of view, is very similar to what one gets in large engaged theories, where you get more colors, more gluon polarizations in at each. And that's also a strategy that one uses in many other areas of physics. When you increase the number of degrees of freedom that you have at a point, you do it for vector models, for Potts models, weighting models, and other models. And that, as I say, that's something that's been full in these cases. But we can also have D appearing in general relativity as the number of connections between nearby points. That's the most basic property of increasing the number of dimensions, that you have more directions in which you can point from a given point. It's the directions out of a point. And this is very similar to then this way of regarding this is very similar to what one does in statistical mechanics. People from statistical mechanics, whenever I talk to them about this, they say, yeah, of course, for this is bread and butter, because when we consider lattices of a large coordination number, by taking this coordination number of the lattice, that's a way in which one can recover the mean field theory of some statistical mechanical system. In this way, what happens is that by diluting effects over a large number of dimensions, then you average out long distance effects. And this is what's useful, for instance, for recovering mean field theory, or for recovering what in statistical mechanics is known as the dynamical mean field theory, or as I was mentioning to Greg before we started the talk, this is what Orlando Alvarez used for studying strings in the large D limit. Because in that case, the fluctuations of the string in a large number of dimensions average out, and one gets control over them. So one can consider quantum effects of the strings at large D in this approximation in an efficient way. So of these two ways in which D appears in gravity, which one is most interesting or most useful for us? Well, this is something that Andy Strominger tried or followed in the early 80s. He studied large D limit of general relativity as similar to the large N limit of gauge theories, but he could only make limited progress in this direction. What we have found is that by focusing on this property of D as giving us diluting interactions as you go at larger directions, this is what's been most useful for us. What we have found is that by exploiting that the gradients of the gravitational potential become steeper and steeper as you go to large D, this is what's given us some leverage, and what's enabled us to make progress in understanding black hole dynamics. So let me go into a bit more of detail of what I mean by this. The basic idea is very, very simple. You consider just the Newtonian potential in a number of space-time dimensions given equal to D. So this is the Newtonian potential. That's just the solution of the Laplace equation in more dimensions. And then, well, as D increases, what you find is that this potential, which in D equals 4, maybe something like this, as you increase D, well, the potential becomes steeper close to this scale and flatter away from it. And the thickness or the extent over which the gravitational potential is non-trivial, is not flat, is very small. It's a further R0 to the D. So even if normally we would think that if D were some fixed number, then in this problem, and particularly in a problem where we have a black hole that's characterized by its radius, we would only have one scale, which is R0. When we consider D as a parameter, we can have two parametrically separated scales, one of them much larger than the other. Which means that D here, or 1 over D, is going to act as a small parameter in the way that we usually like it in physics, that it gives us a separation of scales, that we can separate the dynamics into dynamics at one scale and dynamics at the other scale, and then we can integrate out the dynamics at the short scale and obtain effective theories for the longer distances. This is something that we will see more explicitly in a few minutes. So how do we see, where do we find this potential in general relativity? Well, we find it if in the Tangerlini solution for a black hole in D dimensions, the Tangerlini generalization of the Schwarzschild solution. We get this potential over here, and then how does this solution, how does this geometry behave as we take D to be large? Well, let me describe it just in pictorial ways. That's something very simple. In D equals 4, here you have your black hole horizon, and then there's curvature, the manifold is curved, but the typical scale of the curvature is of the same size, the same parametric order as the black hole radius. Okay, so curvatures over here are of this scale, but when D becomes very large, you have one scale which is characterizing the radius of the black hole, but then you have a much shorter scale which is telling you over which distances this curvature is appreciable. Okay. More explicitly, what you see is that this potential, when R is strictly larger than R naught, then, well, this potential goes to zero as d goes to infinity, which means that you recover flat space away from the horizon. But on the other hand, you can take the limit in a different way, where you're focusing on a thin sliver around the horizon, a sliver of thickness 1 over d. In this region, this is what you have to do when you focus on this region, then this is the region where this gravitational potential remains non-trivial, remains non-zero. Okay. So this is the region, this thin region around the black hole, this is where the gravitational field effects are going to be concentrated in this limit. And that's what will enable us to isolate gravitational dynamics in an efficient way. More detail, I'm going to see that there exists a well-defined near-horizon geometry for black holes. Geometry that's moreover universal, in the sense that, for instance, all neutral non-extremal black holes have the same near-horizon geometry in the Laxity limit. And if you add charges, there are other universality classes. But so there are all of the near-horizon geometries, they simplify a lot in this limit and they fall, as I say, in universality classes. And these near-horizon geometries, you obtain them by taking the limit d goes to infinity while keeping this gravitation potential finite. And something that we found, I'm not going to go into much of the details of this, is that the dynamics of the black hole is localized near this horizon. And this far region where everything was flat, it's something where most of the dynamics is essentially very simple, very trivial. It's like dynamics in flat space. The interesting dynamics occurs in this region that's localized very close to the horizon. Okay. So this near horizon geometry that I've been referring to is something that you can obtain. You take in the previous linear that I was showing you before, you define a new coordinate. You can define it in different ways, but if you define it in this way and then you take d going to infinity while keeping this quantity finite, the geometry that you get takes this form. With big, the radial part and the time part kind of separate from the angular directions, from the other directions. And these two dimensions.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
So near horizon geometry, one often thinks of it as in the limit of a degenerate horizon. Is this limit similar, the one that you're doing here, or is it completely different?
It's, there's some similarities, but there's also significant differences. And one of them is that this is not a degenerate horizon. This is completely, the horizon here is a bifurcated horizon. The reason that you can do this for the Schwarzschild black hole, which is something that you couldn't do in, say, in 4 dimensions, in a finite number of dimensions, is that in that case, you don't have a separation of scales. There's nothing telling you, if you're at some, the only scale that you have is R0. So if you throw away the scale R0, then you're essentially, flattening your horizon. You just get a Rindler limit. If you have a charged black hole, then in that case you can separate the scales. You have a scale that refers to the size of the horizon, and then another scale which is transverse to the horizon, which is the length of the throat, the near extremal throat of, say, horizon black holes, right? So in that case, you can take this near horizon geometry. You can separate. You can take a limit that's well defined. And that gives you a Bertotti-Robinson universe, AD is 2 cross S2 or AD is 2 cross something. And that's something that works because when you have some parameter, because you have charge and mass, you can define a small parameter, which is the difference between mass and charge. And this is what allows you to decouple things. For Schwarzschild, you cannot do that because you don't have any small parameter. Here, what we're using is 1 over d as the small parameter that allows us to separate a region of the geometry. As I say, it's this region that maybe we can say over here. You can separate this region from the background in a way that that's well defined. And all of the dynamics, there's dynamics in this region that decouples from the farther region in the sense that there's some degrees of freedom, fluctuations of the gravitational field, whose propagation into the far region is exponentially suppressed. Actually, it's exponential of 1 over d, so it's something that's non-perturbative in 1 over d. I don't know if I've answered.
Just associated question. When you were showing your graphs before where you had large gradients, the
Yes.
large gradients were well under the horizon, right? And here we want to stay outside.
They are not under the horizon. This is just outside the horizon. This large gradient, this is R0, this is the horizon. So
Oh,
I'm
I
not
see.
going inside the horizon. Yes. So this
Okay.
gradient, the gradient of this solution, this grows at r equals r naught, which is the horizon.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we're not going inside the horizon. If we were to go inside the horizon, then you would also have a near horizon region at the other side of the horizon. And then, well, that would be decoupled from the region where you go to the singularity. I'm not sure whether this clarifies. I'm not going to say the black hole interior has not been that much studied in this limit, but the basic property is this: that there's a very small region close to the black hole horizon, both outside and both inside, where the gravitational potential is finite and non-trivial. Well, inside the horizon, it will go to infinity, but it goes to infinity in an exponentially fast way as you go inside there. You reach the singularity exponentially fast at Laxity. So, as I said, I mean, we find this two-dimensional simple geometry for a black hole, which maybe to some of you, if you're familiar with string theory or with dilatonic black holes in low dimensions, it's a solution that you may have seen before. It's a dilatonic theory, displays the role of the dilaton. And well, the fact that this solution appears at the Laxity limit of Schwarzschild, that was in fact realized many years ago. Maybe not completely understood, but Giro Soda found it, and then later Daniel Miller and collaborators also found them. The solution in string theory that was found by other people, mostly analyzed by Witt in 1991. So this hints at connections to string theory. That again, that's something that I will not be discussing today, but that's something that I think it's at least tantalizing. So this is a near horizon geometry, which, as I say, if you take the Laxity limit of Kerr, or of, well, the higher dimensional generalization of Kerr, the Myers-Briggs solutions, you also get the descent with some other property that tell you that the black hole is rotating, but you get essentially the same structure. So as I was saying, all of the black hole physics is concentrated in this small region close to the horizon. So when D goes to infinity, actually what you find is that when the black hole is replaced by something that looks like a hole in your flat spacetime, it's kind of a membrane. So here you have some flat spacetime and distorted background. It could also be anti-de Sitter, or de Sitter if you wanted. But in this limit, you're kind of, what this picture suggests is that you can replace the black hole with some membrane, with some surface that contains all of the dynamics of this thin region around the horizon. And then you may ask yourself, what is the dynamics of this membrane? Because this membrane, this effective membrane that we want to find, that describes all of the things that this black hole can do, the dynamics of this membrane should, and this is a black hole, this is governed by the Einstein equation. So the dynamics of this membrane is something that we should be able to reobtain or to recover from the Einstein equations. The Einstein equations should allow us to derive effective equations that describe the dynamics, the possible shapes, or the fluctuations, the evolution of the perturbations, or nonlinear fluctuations actually, of this effective membrane. So this is the idea in pictures. I'm going to go into a few equations in a few slides. But the idea is that this is what we're going to do. We're going to solve the Einstein equations near the horizon, not solve them fully, and we're going to solve at least the radial dependence, as we will see, and then out of this get something like an effective membrane theory. For those of you who are familiar with effective theories of black holes, like they appear in the fluid gravity correspondences and the other ideas related to ADS CFT, this is essentially the nonlinear effective theory of the lightest quasi-normal modes of the black hole. You can obtain, this is something that we began doing when we began studying Laxity black holes. We began analyzing quasi-normal modes, and we found that we could simplify a lot the calculation of quasi-normal mode frequencies of black holes at Laxity, and we realized that there was a separation between different modes according to how the frequencies scale with V. There were some modes that were light, and these modes, these slowest modes, the one that typically dominate ring down of a black hole, these lightest or lowest or slowest quasi-normal modes, these we found that they can be described not only at the linear level, that's what quasi-normal modes do, we can also find the dynamics of these quasi-normal modes described non-linearly. And this is what these effective membrane theories do. They are nonlinear theories of the slowest fluctuations of the black holes. In order to see how this is possible, what we can do, how we can derive these effective theories, well, we can consider a fluctuating horizon. A horizon where we're going to, since we want to have this dilution of lines of force away from a point, we're going to consider that some of the directions of the horizon are take the shape of a sphere. So, I mean, this is an object that you may think, you want to think of it as some black brane, that's okay, but it may not be a black brane. It's just some black hole that has some directions where, well, or at least a large number of them are in the shape of spheres. So when you have all of these directions in the shape of spheres, what this means is that the gravitational field away from this direction, from these spherical directions, gravitational field is going to, as we were saying, is going to fall off very quickly. Gradients in the radial direction are going to be large. They are going to scale like d. This is what we saw before. This is the gradient of this potential. It scales like d. It's very large. Whereas we're going to consider that in directions, and the other directions parallel to the horizon, we separate out some directions from the horizon, and we then consider that the gradients, the variation of the geometry in directions parallel to the horizon are of order 1, or at least smaller than d. They could also be in some circumstances we want to consider them these gradients to be square root of d. Okay? But what this does for us, and this property is what comes out of taking this large d limit, where, as I was saying, you have large gradients away from the horizon. Now, when you do this, what you get is that when you write down the Einstein equations in an appropriate way, which I'm going to show in the next slide, what this means is that you can separate the radial dependence from the dependence that equations have in other directions, in the time direction and these other directions along the horizon. And this, what it allows you is to separate equations into sets. You can integrate explicitly the radial direction while leaving the other directions still unsolved. By integrating this, what you obtain are functions of the other directions that we haven't still integrated, and these functions of these other directions, where the gradients are slower, this is what will give us the effective fields. Just to exemplify the way in which this can work in a simple case, this is efficient way of doing it, at least for static configurations. You can take an ansatz for your metric where you're explicitly making the radial direction small. I mean, that's large. The gradients in the radial direction are going to go like d. If we write it like this, if we consider this is of order 1 and this is of order 1, and then the rest of the metric, well, we write it in this way. One can generalize this. One can do something that would be more like an ADM decomposition of the R direction, but for simplicity, let me do this. So you know that when you write a metric like this, you can take the Einstein equations and well, decompose them, do a d plus 1 decomposition of them, where these are the directions transverse to this. So you have here things that have the derivatives of R. The extrinsic curvature of the metric in the R direction is one of them, but then you also have this radial evolution equation, and then you have other equations which are, you can think of them as constraints in the R direction, are independent constraints. Okay? So you can separate out here the radial direction, and these equations, the equation here, you have a factor of d that separates them from the others, and this is what you eventually use when you write this down in more detail. This is what you use in order to integrate the radial direction, and then these equations, we leave them unsolved. And this, in this limit, are what's going to give us the effective theory. A simple case for this is that something that's easy to work out. If you do this for the case where you just have one of these directions, this direction Z is just one of them, and you consider static configurations. Now this is kind of a tubular configuration, something like it could be, well, a string, or it could be, I mean, if this closes, it could be a sphere. Well, what you find in the large limit is that this constraint, the momentum constraint in the R direction, reduces to something very simple. It's just that the extrinsic curvature of this surface over here has to be constant, or with a redshift. We could also add some momentum, and then we would have, or at least motion, and then we would have a gamma factor over here. But essentially what we find is that the shape of this membrane that describes the horizon, because this is very close to the horizon, it's at a distance 1/d from the horizon, this horizon membrane, it has to satisfy this equation. This comes out of just the Einstein equations. So by solving this equation, which is essentially a soap bubble equation, if you didn't have this, this would be the equation that soap bubbles have to satisfy. Then what we find is that the shape of the horizon at Laxity is determined by this thing that we call the soap bubble equation. So this is a way of just saying that a static soap bubble in something that's asymptotically flat, or even in ADS, in Minkowski, is what describes the Schwarzschild black hole in the Laxity limit. We can also have these soap bubbles, as I was saying, we can give them some velocity, then that equation, you would have the equations for a soap bubble. It would be a relativistic soap bubble, not the kind of soap bubbles that you blow in your garden with your kids. But it's again a very simple equation for this relativistic soap bubble, and that we checked that it describes correctly the shape of the horizon of Myers-Berry black holes in the Laxity limit. So this is just a simple example for static configurations or stationary configurations. But we want to do more. We want to study what happens to these soap bubbles or these membranes as we go, well, as we make them dynamical, if we let them have non-trivial dependence on time. Now, then the analysis of the equations becomes more complicated than this thing that I've shown to you here, but it can be done. And, I think it's fair to say that the most general and most elegant formulation of this Laxity effective theory, it has been worked out by Anthony Bhattacharya, Siraj Mingwala, and their collaborations the collaborators in India. And they worked out what this effective theory for these black holes, this effective membrane theory, and they came out with equations which take this form. They are formulated in terms of the extrinsic curvature of the membrane and a velocity field on the membrane, the same thing, the same kind of ingredients of effective fields that I described before. This quantity over here is the extrinsic curvature. There's some constraints. This is the projector on spatial direction for the membrane. And the equations, take, as I say, take this form. They are non-linear. It's quite remarkable, I think, that all of the complications of the Einstein equations can be boiled down to something like this. But these equations, as I say, they are general, they are elegant, and so on, but they are fairly unwieldy. They are not that easy to solve in general. So the equations there, as I say, they are unwieldy, but they simplify in two important cases. One of them is the one that I mentioned before. Okay? So they simplify when you consider stationary black holes. So in that case, you can very easily verify that this equation simplifies just to the constraint that the extrinsic curvature is constant. So this is what I described before. But then they also simplify in the case where what you're having is a black brane. A black brane, not a spherical black hole of topology, but something that's extended. And it turns out that the equations for those two cases, they can be derived from the formalism, the equations of Bhattacharya, Mingwala, and collaborators, but actually they were derived independently. We derived them independently in a less elegant way, maybe, but perhaps a little faster way. We derived them in, well, collaboration with all my Japanese friends and collaborators. Okay, but they even if the approach of Bhattacharya and Mingwala looks at first sight very different from what we did, at the end of the day, the ideas are the same. The formalism or the way that we derive equations, the setup, the choice of variables, gauges, and everything, we do it in a different way, but we end up with the same set of effective equations at the end of the day. Okay, so even if there's different ways of doing things, we are at the end, it's reassuring that we get the same effective theories. So for black branes, which is what I'm going to talk about for the most of the rest of the talk, coming back to this, as I said, now we consider that this is some black brane horizon. It's an object that exists in more dimensions, that's extended, and we have a number of dimensions here in the shape of a sphere, but these objects also extend in a finite number of these directions. Now, the effective theory in this case, the fields that we get, we had them previously in terms of the extrinsic curvature and velocity field. Turns out here that they can be also rewritten in a way that maybe it's a little more intuitive, something that we can describe as the mass density or area density of the membrane at each point, something that measures, say, the thickness of the brane at each point, and then also in terms of something that could be some pressure of or momenta along the brane, directly related to the velocity field that we showed before. Okay. So this effective theory is something that doesn't depend on the radial, on the solution that we get. We can get the full metric actually, but in this full metric we've determined explicitly what is the dependence of the metric in the direction transverse to the membrane, in this radial direction. This is integrated. And then the rest, for this, we have effective equations in terms of these fields. And by solving those effective equations, we're guaranteed from the derivation that we're solving the Einstein's equations in the full Einstein set of Einstein equations. What are these equations, these effective equations for these fluctuations of the black brane? Well, this is what we worked out, 2015, in terms of these variables. The equations take this, I think it's a fairly simple form. Okay, so what I'm saying is that if you solve these equations for these fields, then you can reconstruct a metric, and it's the reconstruction of the metric is very explicit because we obtain this from some ansatz for the metric. So by solving these equations, which depend on the T and Z directions, the R direction that's integrated, then all of the other dimensions are just dimensions of that sphere, those are cyclic coordinates, nothing depends on them. So by doing this, we're solving the Einstein's equations. By solving these equations, if we manage to solve these equations, then we're solving the Einstein's equations to lead in order in the 1/d expansion. You can also work out corrections to these equations, and we have them. We have worked them out, we and other groups, we've worked out corrections to these equations that come with suppression factors of 1/d. But for this talk, I'm only going to focus on the leading Laxity equations, which are, as I say, these ones. And these equations are, as I said, the equations that describe fluctuations of these black branes, at least as long as the gradients of these fluctuations are not very large, that they don't exceed, that they don't become as large as D. But of course here, to lead in order the large D, we're taking D to infinity, so in principle they are valid, at least they are good approximation for a sufficiently large number of dimensions. So let's have a look at these equations. I've written them in a way that I'm sure that they reminded you of diffusion equations. So this is, if we didn't have these right-hand sides, this would be diffusion equations. They would describe diffusion of mass fluctuations and of momentum fluctuations, but they are not exactly diffusion equations. There are also here some gradient terms. And also, well, the equations, these terms, they would still give us linear equations. But you know that the Einstein equations, you don't expect the Einstein equations for a full fluctuating object to become just linear. These equations are nonlinear, but all of the nonlinearity is concentrated in just this last term. Okay? So the equations are almost linear, they are almost like diffusion equations, but they are not quite so. They have these things that would source the diffusion, and also they have this nonlinearity over here. There are other ways of writing these equations where they look more like equations of hydrodynamics, and this is something that we did, but I'm not going to discuss here. You can find that in the review that I mentioned before. But the fact that the nonlinearity is concentrated in that term, this means that these equations, well, maybe they are going to be much simpler to solve than, well, certainly they are going to be much simpler to solve than the full Einstein equation. So this is what gives power to this Laxity approach. Another thing that you see, well, if these are diffusion equations, then, well, this means that these equations are irreversible. And this is what, in fact, what you expect when you study horizon dynamics. Horizons are famously dissipative systems. You throw something into a black hole, the black hole vibrates, and these vibrations die away. The quasi-normal modes relax, and then you get irreversibility. In fact, one can show that from those equations, one can construct something that a current that gives you, that exemplifies or that represents, captures this irreversibility. Something that's an entropy current, actually. Okay? So you can construct out of those equations a quantity that satisfies and whose divergence is non-negative. And this is actually due to, well, viscous dissipation on the horizon, something that may be familiar to you, maybe from the membrane paradigm. This is not the same as the membrane paradigm. It's similar, but it's not quite the same. It's also something that appears in these fluid gravity correspondences. It's related to that, even if it's it's a different incarnation of that phenomenon of viscous dissipation on a horizon. Now the equations are relatively simple, and well, it's easy to find a solution. The solution where the horizon is uniform, where the mass density on the horizon is constant and there's no momentum. That's a solution that's easy to find. That's just what corresponds to the flat black brane. But now we can fluctuate it. We can make it fluctuate. We can study perturbations, linear or non-linear, but we may start with linear fluctuations of this black brane. You just take m equals 1 plus something small and p something small, then you linearize the equations around the black brane, and then you find what are the spectrum, what's the spectrum of these fluctuations. And what do you find when you study the spectrum of fluctuations of the black brane? Well, what you find is that the black brane becomes unstable. It has modes, there are fluctuations of this, it's mode unstable. You can have modes that grow exponentially in time. Is this something that we should be worried about, or is this something that we should be surprised about, that the black brane in this description is unstable to fluctuations? Well, actually, we shouldn't be surprised about this, because it was already known, it's been already known for almost 30 years, that black strings and black branes, more generally, they are unstable. This was proven by Ruth Gregory and Ray Laflamme, who studied, they took the metric of the geometry for a black brane, or a black string. They studied linear gravitational perturbations. They studied the linearized mode instability, and they found that these objects become unstable. They become unstable to rippling. Just like, I mean, you think of a black string, some tube, and just like a fluid tube is unstable to, well, developing the famous Rayleigh plateau instability, where your fluid tube splits into droplets of water, something that you can see in your kitchen sink every day. So something similar happens for black strings. And this was proven by Gregory and Laflamme by solving the perturbation equations numerically. What we have found here is that we can do everything analytically in this Laxity limit and reproduce this instability. So I say, what this does is that when the string clamps, this is something that this is actually this movie that I've been showing here is what we get by evolving the equations evolving the nonlinear fluctuations of the black string using these Laxity effective theories. This is something that you have to do. The nonlinear, those equations are nonlinear. You have to solve them numerically, but you can do them in Mathematica with one line of code. You can do it with ND-solve in Mathematica immediately. I mean, this simulation producing it takes longer to type than it takes for Mathematica to solve the equations. Okay, so we reproduce a problem of higher dimensional general relativity that's not easy to solve. The nonlinear evolution of the black string stability. This is something that it took many years actually to solve. So Gregory and Laflamme solved the linearized instability. Evolving this instability beyond the linearized approximation, it required a supercomputer calculation that Louis Lerner and Franz Pretorius completed in I think it was in 2011 maybe, or something like that, that they managed to solve that by having a supercomputer running for 1 month doing that calculation. Now, in the Laxity limit, as I said, you can do it in your laptop in a fraction of a second. Of course, this is in the Laxity limit, it doesn't capture all of the physics, but at least it captures the main properties of this, the main features of this phenomenon. And this is something that we've studied in quite a lot of detail, because if you can do this so efficiently, maybe you can study corrections, or you can study other aspects of this instability. Let me now move on to something different.
Can I ask, is there a nice universal scaling solution for after the pinch in large D?
We think that there should be. Some scaling that describes the approach to the singularity, but this hasn't been found yet. And we have some ideas for how to find that. That would be very interesting. But the formation of the singularity, that's something that I don't think it's been understood analytically. And the Laxity equations fail, they break down when you're very close to the singularity, actually. Because at that point, gradients are becoming very large, which means that this gradient separation that you had before, the gradients are becoming arbitrarily large. So the Laxity expansion breaks down.
I see. Okay.
So that's, you can follow it quite a bit, but at some point you cannot rely on this approximation anymore. But you can see that it's going to pinch. Laxity is telling you that the stream is pinching, and that the pinching doesn't stop. Well, it may stop in some regimes, but at least in some cases, in some regimes, you know that it doesn't stop, and then you see that it's going. You can describe the approach to that scaling regime, but the scaling regime itself is not captured by Laxity, by this approximation. Okay. So it's a good method for telling you that you're going to pinch, but it doesn't tell you how you're going to pinch. And this is related to something that I want to discuss later, because I mean that problem of black strings, that's very fine. I mean, particularly if you're interested in things higher dimensional gravity or string theory or AES-50, you may be interested in those black branes. But something that every person who works on general relativity is interested in is in black hole collisions, and also in possibility of having cosmic censorship violation. And this Laxity expansion turns out that it gives us a good way of modeling black hole collisions in higher dimensions. I'm going to begin by showing you something that we obtained out of a Laxity simulation. Okay, so this is the result of an actual calculation using this Laxity effective theory. The black blobs are supposed to be, they represent black holes. So we see that we have two black holes colliding, then forming a single black hole, then developing something that's this kind of bar mode, barred object, but this bar becomes unstable and then it breaks and separates. Okay. So what does this movie that I'm showing you here, what's behind it? Well, first of all, it's the idea that we can describe a black hole as a blob on that membrane. Okay, so that membrane, as I was saying, it's unstable to clamping. And what you could see here in this picture is that this looks quite a bit like a spherical black hole. Okay, and that's the idea, that these black strings are going to break up into spherical black holes. Now you have this not only on a black string, you can also have that on a black brane. This localization, what it gives you, I mean, this is an actual evolution of the equations. You perturb the equations in a particular way, and then you find that they localize and form something like black hole blobs, depending on whether you plot the area density or the area radius, which is the logarithm of that. Then you get, so those blobs in this black membrane, and here the black membrane goes to essentially zero thickness at large distances. So this blob is a representation of a black hole. So we're thinking now of a black hole as some blob on this thin black membrane. Okay? And these blobs are solutions that we can find explicitly out of the equations that I showed you before. Those equations have solutions for blobs, Gaussian blobs. Okay? And then these blobs, we can show that they appear as the Laxity limit of, say, a Schwarzschild black hole. Those are explicit solutions. We know them in every dimension, and we know that these blobs capture very well the properties of Schwarzschild black holes or even rotating black holes. But then, well, these blobs, we can move them because those equations have a boost symmetry. So we can take one of these blobs and boost it, and that's a moving black hole. Then we also found that solutions that describe other objects, things that we call black bars. This is, like we were showing, this is an elongated black hole, which is rotating. It's not radiating because in the limit of very large radiation is very much suppressed. But these are solutions of those equations that I showed you before. These equations over here, they have solutions that describe these lamps on that membrane. So these black holes as blobs, we could sometimes call it a blobology of black holes, or black holes as lamps. Well, you can study these lamps, you can perturb them, you can study, you can collide them and so on, and you can compare them with the properties of non-black holes, of things that you can do out of general relativity, Einstein's equations. By working hard, you can compare the results that we get out of this theory with the results that you get out of solving the Einstein equations the hard way. And then we find that the blobology, these lamps, capture accurately the properties of stationary solutions, like the rotating black holes, also the quasi-normal mode spectrum, which here obtaining quasi-normal perturbations of these blobs is much simpler than doing the quasi-normal mode analysis of the Einstein equations. We can study how entropy is produced when you collide these blobs, or when they merge, or when they split. And you can also, this is what I've shown you before, you can collide them, okay? And you can have them merge, these two blobs. So the collisions of the black hole blobs, well, these are blobs that live on a membrane. The membrane is part of the horizon. So you have horizon everywhere. We don't get rid of this. So all of this, you should think of having a thin horizon that extends in brane horizon, that extends everywhere. And on top of this, we have large blobs. And these blobs, they represent the black holes. Close to the brane, they are not very accurately described, but that's a small region. And at large, that's technically small. So actually, since we have these blobs moving on this membrane, and the membrane is connecting off the horizon, the black holes never really merge nor split. Okay, so there's a smooth evolution. That's why we don't encounter singularities when they split. But then we can take two of these blobs, collide them like this. This is again a numerical simulation that one can do in a laptop. And this takes not just a fraction of a second, this takes a few minutes. But it's something that you can do. You collide two of these black holes, and then they collide, and then what you form is a single blob, a single black hole. That's the collision of two black holes with a small enough angular momentum and small enough impact parameter. So they collide, they form a single blob, and then this relaxes into a rotating black hole. Now, if the impact parameter is larger, or the total angular momentum is larger, what you'll find is that what you're forming is an elongated horizon, something that looks like a rotating bar. This bar, as I said, it's not radiating perturbatively in 1/d. Radiation is non-perturbative, or emission of radiation from this object is non-perturbative in 1/d. So it's something that you don't see easily, and this object can be long-lived because of this, because otherwise an elongated object that's rotating general relativity is going to be radiating, emitting radiation waves. Radiation can be incorporated, but the theory at this limit is excluding it. Now, if we collide now two of these blobs with more angular momentum, it could be intrinsic or orbital angular momentum, then what we find is a simulation like this. To first form a single blob, something that looks like a bar, but then this blob, then it's unstable and it fragments. Okay. What you see at the end of this simulation is just some numerical noise that's irrelevant. So this is what the picture that I showed you, the movie that I showed you a few minutes ago, this picture with the two lamps, the two black lamps. This is what I was showing to you. I was replacing this, or taking a view from above, a density plot, where I drew in black, anything that was above some density over here. So this is what's telling us that in these collisions, we expect to find, a single black hole horizon, and then this is going to pinch. Of course, the moment of the pinch, as I was saying before, that's something that's not well described by this Laxity theory, but the evidence that we have from the regular instability is telling us that this pinch will proceed, it will not stop, it will pinch at a singularity, at a curvature singularity. And then, what happens to this singularity? Well, the natural evolution of this singularity is that this singularity is going to, in a sense, evaporate. One can be a bit more precise about what the evaporation here would mean. But then the black hole the horizon is going to fragment, and you're going to end up with two black holes flying apart. Okay? So this would be a violation of cosmic censorship that we would have in the collision of black holes when the number of dimensions is sufficiently large. Let me say, I don't have the reference here, but this is something that we did using this Laxity effective theory. But there's been actual numerical simulations at finite number of dimensions in 6 and 7 dimensions, where you collide two black holes in 6 dimensions with sufficiently large angular momentum. This has been done by Tomás Andrade and Pau Figueras and Ulis Perhake. They collided two black holes, then, well, they let them evolve, they form a single horizon, then they begin to rotate, but at some point they break apart into an elongated object, and then this becomes, well, more and more, and you have two blobs with a thin tube stretching between them. And this thin tube is shrinking and shrinking in very much the same way as happens for black strings. So they verified explicitly with full numerical relativity in 6 and 7 dimensions that the picture that we obtained with this Laxity theory is correct. Now, just to mention something, I'm coming to the end in a couple of minutes, something that it's in progress with people who are or have been recently in Barcelona, what we call naked pinches and black tsunamis in anti-de space. It's an elaboration, or it's another direction in which we're using these effective theories for black holes and black strings and black branes in higher dimensions, but now in anti-de space, which is of interest, particularly if you're interested in holography. But this phenomenon of the instability of a black string that Grorel and Laflamme found, it's also present if you have a black string in anti-de. Here I'm representing the hyperbolic space as the Poincaré disk. It's a constant time section. One can easily construct solutions of Einstein anti-de gravity that describe black strings that stretch between asymptotic points of anti-de Sitter. And it was proven by Hirayama and Kang in the 2000s, I think, sometime, that these objects, when they are thin enough, they are also unstable. I mean, they can also pinch. They develop a linearized instability. But this instability, this linear instability of these black strings and anti-de space, it hasn't been followed yet non-linearly by any evolution, any non-linear evolution of the equations. And this is what we have done using this Laxity theory. We have followed the non-linear evolution of the instability of black strings in anti-de Sitter. And why are we interested in this? Well, first of all, because from ADS-CFT point of view, this is interesting because you have black holes at the boundary, and what you're describing in dual terms is Hawking radiation from black holes in a compact universe. So the CFT dual interpretation is interesting, but also because from the point of view of the bulk, there's interesting dynamics. Here you have an infinite horizon. It's a non-compactly generated horizon, which means that the area theorem doesn't apply to it. You can have horizon generators coming from infinity and adding to the size of the horizon in the bulk. So that's an effect that you can have. But you can also have, you're going to also have, since this object is unstable, it will also pinch. So you have an effect, you have something that you can have generators coming from the horizon, which will tend to make the horizon larger, but the horizon here also wants to shrink, to pinch. So we have found evolutions of the Laxity equations where the horizon pinches to a singularity, what we expect to be a singularity until the point that the equations break down. But at the same time, you have also, in a slower process, because this happens on a very fast scale, and this happens in a slower scale, you also have what we call a tsunami. You have a wave, massive wave of horizon generators coming from the boundary to the bulk. And then what they do is that you form the singularity, but then when the tsunami arrives, it's like, well, you know what, that when a tsunami comes, first you have the water receding from the beach, but then the tsunami comes and washes it all out. Okay, so this is what we're finding. First you pinch to a singularity, and then the tsunami arrives and covers it. So you have a naked singularity, but which is then censored out by the black tsunami. Okay. And there's in fact quite a rich phenomenology of dynamics in this setup that well, we're now in the process of writing up our results. So I'll come now to my conclusions. I'll try to keep the conclusions brief. Well, my aim has been to show you that the Laxity expansion, it is at least a very efficient way of reformulating horizon dynamics. You can describe black holes with different shapes. You can also describe their fluctuations, and the ripples and nonlinear fluctuations. So it's something that's efficient. Of course, it has limits. There are things that we cannot really describe. For instance, this approach to singularity, or at least within the methods that I've described here, that doesn't seem to work. We think that maybe by changing the formulation, we can do something, but that's something that is still in progress. But at least for horizon fluctuations, the dynamics of black holes, this is a very efficient way of reformulating everything in terms of equations, which are much simpler than the full Einstein's equations. But then, besides horizon dynamics, there's other things in general relativity that one may be interested in. People have been already applying this kind of formulation for other problems in ADS-CFT, and or also for applications to ADS-CMT and ADS duals of condensed matter systems. And this is what, in fact, my collaborator, my co-writer, Chris Herzog, has done quite a bit of work on, applying Laxity to holography of condensed matter systems. There's also been work on capturing holographic entanglement, like radiotocharacteristic surfaces, things that are also very much studied these days from the point of view of string theory and holography. Veronica Hubeni, John Soss, and collaborators wrote a very nice paper on this. Another very interesting problem that may be amenable to a Laxity expansion with different methods than what I've described is the problem of a chop-tweak critical collapse. That would be very interesting if we could get a handle, an analytical handle on this problem using the Laxity expansion. Also, quantum properties of black holes at Laxity. This is something that hasn't been as much studied as I think it deserves. And then also, while using this connection, as I said, between Laxity limits and statistical mechanics, there's connections to SYK type of models that I think also deserve more attention. As I say, if you want more details about what I've said before, or about what some suggestions for these directions, I recommend that you go to the review that Chris and I wrote last year. And with this, I'll stop and thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, Roberto, for the fantastic talk. So thank Roberto, and we have time for some questions. So just unmute yourself and ask.
So maybe I can ask a question. So can you expand on this suggestion about chop-tweak criticality using this method? This sounds like a very interesting idea.
Exactly. So I think I agree with that. That's very interesting. So first of all, let me give you evidence. What evidence do we have that the Laxity expansion can be a good approach to this problem? Well, first of all, numerical analysis of chop-tweak critical collapse in different dimensions. This has been done by a number of people, mostly by Gabor Kunstatter and students. They've studied critical collapse numerically up to fairly large number of dimensions, maybe up to almost d equals 20.
But even in 4, if you don't assume a scalar field, it's still controversial, right? So if you say 4-dimensional axis symmetry, it's widely open.
Yeah, actually, with yeah, I mean, I'm just considering spherical symmetry, okay? But with axial symmetry, yeah, it's more complicated. But just I mean, the problem is that this is, of course, this is a problem that well, the way to analyze it is numerically, and then the numerics are not simple at all. And you get some critical exponents, particularly the critical. So there's two things that you may want to study: the critical exponent and the echoing period, the cases where you have a discrete self-similarity. Okay? The critical exponent is something that just is some number that comes out of your numerics. And well, for the Chop-Tweak case of scalar field collapse in 4 dimensions is 0.378 or something, that critical exponent of the collapse. And then, well, natural thing is to assume that this is some irrational number, something that you just have to work out by numerics. But then people, as I said, when people have computed this in other number of dimensions and then plotted the evolution of this critical exponent, they find that the critical exponent grows, and it seems to asymptote to 1/2. And the evidence is, I mean, it really does look like when you go to increase the number of dimensions, the critical exponent is going to 1/2. And then if you get to 1/2, well, then you say, well, you begin to think that, well, maybe this is something that we should be able to reproduce. There's, in fact, some calculations of systems which are similar to what we've been discussing. There was an analysis by Andy Strominger and Larius Thorlacius, where they studied critical collapse or something similar to critical collapse in what's known as the CGHS model, a two-dimensional model. That model has the same near horizon geometry as the black hole in the Laxity limit. And in that case, the exponent that they found was exactly 1/2. So that's something that's suggested that maybe Laxity, the Laxity limit, you should be able to find some simplification. And then, even more. I mean, if you work out what maybe the corrections, 1/d corrections to this 1/2, well, you can very simply fit something that gives you the values of these 1/d corrections with very good accuracy. So maybe not only you can reproduce leading 1/2 result, but maybe even corrections. Now, how do you do this? Well, it's not very clear how to do it. I mean, people have tried. The best, the most, of what's been published, because we've been trying hard for some time. But there was a paper by Benson Way and Mosso Rosali, where they studied a scalar gravity system, spherically symmetric in the Laxity, and they found well, something that wasn't just critical behavior, but they found some oscillatory solutions for the scalar field in gravity that at some point they seemed like they would collapse into a black hole, and one could extract something that would be something like an exponent of this, describing this collapse that was also 1/2. It wasn't critical collapse because it didn't collapse to zero size, it collapsed to a singularity, and it didn't have a self-similarity, but it was something that was kind of suggested. The reason that also this is something that I think you may think, if you just consider spherically symmetric, the spherically symmetric system, then your problem is, at the end of the day, is always a 1+1 problem. And with the scaling symmetry, I mean, well, if you have continuous self-similarity, it's just obvious, but you don't want continuous self-similarity. You want discrete self-similarity. But it's a problem that the effective dimensionality of the problem, if you just consider a spherically symmetric sector, then the problem it has the effective same dimensionality. It's 1+1. What you get is that when D goes large, well, the equations you expect that they are going to simplify. They cannot get more complicated. There's going to be some terms that are going to drop out of your equations, and some terms are going to become more important and so on. So this looks like it's a problem that well, you may have some hopes, because first of all, the numerical evidence seems to give you to aim at reproducing a critical exponent of 1/2. The echoing period, it's much less clear what it does when D goes large. Whether we've been hoping, but it's just hope, that when D goes to infinity, the discrete self-similarity becomes continuous self-similarity. But this is just a hope. We haven't been able to put it on a firmer ground. If it were discrete continuous self-similarity, then of course, then you would get it a lot, because in that case you can simplify your system, reduce one more dimension of your system. So this is what I can say so far. It's been, for us, it's been kind of a pet project, or well, an interesting project, a bit of, and something that's been elusive so far, but we're not giving up. I think that there should be some solution. I mean, if we don't find it, maybe somebody else will do. But I think it's a problem that's
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
I'm sorry because well, I rambled on for very long on this reply.
So I think you said that you could reproduce the long wavelength hydrodynamic quasi-normal modes with this formalism. What happens to the radius of the bound null geodesics in this limit? Do they move into the high gradient part of the geometry, or are they?
So they move closer. So one of the first things that one also sees when you study the large limit of, say, the Schwarzschild black hole or other black holes is that the photon sphere, it also shrinks. It becomes closer and closer to the horizon. So I mean, that's the photon ring describes, in a sense, the boundary of this near horizon region. And that's, if you study wave propagation, that's the peak of the potential. That's at the photon ring. So this is what's kind of, I mean, your potential, effective potential. If you study scalar wave equation in Schwarzschild, then you get a potential that's highly peaked, and this peak is at the photon ring. Now, if you want to study properties of other things like geodesics and so on, we haven't studied this that much, but I think there should be simplifications. Also, well, when one wants to do analysis of geodesics particle or null geodesics in this Laxity limit, of course, one has to bear in mind that there's qualitative changes between 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions, and dimensions larger than 6. And for instance, circular orbits or bound orbits are unstable in more than 5 dimensions. If you want to study, I mean, largely, I don't think it, for instance, it's a good method for studying celestial dynamics. For null geodesics, I don't know, we haven't studied this much.
I see. So you haven't tried to match the iconal part of the spectrum yet?
Really. No. But I think I mean, it's an open problem, and it's probably something that one can have a look at and see whether there's significant simplification.
Okay. Do we have any other questions for Roberto?
Can I ask a basic question?
Sure.
Very interesting talk. Yeah, could you tell me more about the equation, like the effective equations you got, like once you integrated out the fluctuating degrees of freedom?
Yes.
So those equations you claim that that basically captures pretty much the Einstein equations, like the after the like not this equation, but like the other coupled equations.
Yeah. So these are, I mean, this is a set of PDEs, coupled nonlinear PDEs, just like the Einstein equations also are. So we get, and in that sense, the equations are still nonlinear coupled PDEs. Something that you don't that you get rid of or that you've solved already in these equations is gauge symmetry. I mean, all of the problems of fixing gauges and everything, all of that is taken care of already. So that's something that simplifies. I mean, the gauge redundancy that remains here is simple. I mean, it's essentially trivial.
Right.
But,
right.
yes.
So basically, where are these equations like basically defined? Like, are they defined on the space time after you do on like some
yeah.
some space?
So you imagine this as some sort of black hole. The radial direction is solved, so you can reconstruct the metric. Maybe I can show maybe a bit more explicitly in the case of the black brane.
Right.
So this is a metric in so large number of dimensions. Well, here I should put also the sphere, but this is some Eddington-Finkelstein type of gauge for your metric, so it's appropriate for describing horizons. So the effective fields, I mean, the R direction, this is what we're integrating. This is solved. We solve the equations and we determine that the R dependence for this ansatz for the metrics our dependence is of this kind. Now, these equations now depend on functions that are in the metric functions, but are now functions of time and the directions along the brane direction. Okay, I should put here also this figures. I don't know why I forgot it. But then, the equations, so the Einstein equations, part of the Einstein equations have been solved for this metric. The radial dependence has been solved, but the rest of the equations are not solved. The rest of the equations are those effective equations that I showed earlier, which only depend on this, on T and C.
Right. So could you like go to those evolution equations for M and like P, like the thing you're talking about, like the kind of diffusion equation?
Yes.
So yeah, I was kind of confused like about that. Like I didn't understand. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something. Like, so are those equations, these equations, like the principal part seems to be, parabolic.
Yes.
So aren't these like problematic because they seem to like violate causality,
Okay. So the fact that they are parabolic, this is because in this limit that we're taking, the equations essentially become non-relativistic.
Okay, so like there is no concept of like, light cone or anything here.
No, I mean, the reason, or at least is that, so these are describing fluctuations of a black brane horizon. You can put a ripple on this. The ripples on this horizon, they travel at a speed that's actually dependent on the number of dimensions.
Okay.
So if you consider one of these horizons, you put, I mean, the ripples dissipate, but well, they also travel. They have a real and imaginary part for their wave number, if you want, or their frequency. So these ripples propagate. They propagate like sound, like damped sound on the horizon. So they propagate, but the speed of propagation is something that goes like 1/d.
Okay.
And this is what this is capturing. The ripples on the horizon, their velocity becomes small, much smaller than the speed of light when d becomes large.
Right. So this makes sense. Okay.
This is the reason that these equations are becoming now parabolic. They are becoming non-relativistic. This system has non-relativistic Galilean symmetry, actually.
Right.
So that's a property of this Laxity limit, that the fluctuations along the direction of the horizon, they are slower, much slower than the speed of light.
Okay.
The equations, I think that they are very interesting. I think because, as I said, they describe a lot of physics of black holes. We've seen that they can even describe collisions. But they are equations that, when you look at them, they look fairly simple. When we found them, we were astonished that they look like this. And they also have a hydrodynamic interpretation, a hydrodynamic form. And they are nonlinear. The nonlinearity is just contained in this. At first, we thought that maybe they have solitons, but they don't have solitons. They are dissipated. And they don't seem to support solitary waves, but maybe there's more to these equations than we've seen.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, well, if there are no other questions, let's thank Roberto again for a fantastic talk, and we'll see everybody again next week. Thanks,
Thank you.
Roberto. It was great.
Thank you. Bye.